Okay, well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Aaron's Show, the podcast for blind persons where we talk about issues in the blindness community. Tonight we have a very special guest with us, someone who I believe I met as a young person when I was maybe 12 years old. I think I met this person. So, ladies and gentlemen, we want to give a very warm welcome to Jason Polanski. Jason, welcome to Aaron's Show. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. So, Jason, why don't you start out by basically telling our viewers or telling our listeners, how we met at first, because I remember now where and how we met, and that is something that I think the viewers and the listeners will find very interesting. So, why don't you start there?
Yeah, so honestly, I'm not quite sure how, I don't remember exactly how we met. I know, uh, I don't know if we met first through the National Federation of the Blind of Maryland, or I know both of us also went to NASA Space Camp in Huntsville, Alabama. So I don't
Right.
know if that's
That's
where we met
that
first or
one.
if we met before then.
The issue of which came first in this case. I'm not concerned with that. I wanted you to talk about the space camp,
Okay,
um,
yes, yeah.
because I think that is actually something that I kind of forget about, and I do not always tell people that I did that, um, for a lot of reasons. Actually, as my listeners know, and as I will tell you, Jason, nowadays, nowadays I'm a teacher, and I work for myself as a teacher. Um, and we keep on my podcast. I have a special announcement for you and for listeners that on this podcast we need to keep our locations classified. So I am sending from an undisclosed location, and so are you. Okay, and there's a lot of reasons we do that. But yes, we met while attending space camp, NASA's space camp for the blind. So why don't you talk for a while, talk for a bit about that experience, and as you go
Yeah,
through, I will help you. So go.
yeah. So guess I went twice. Once when I was like 9, and once when I was like 12. And basically, it's a whole week in the end of toward the end of September. So I think I saw on Facebook actually that this year's just ended not too long ago, like last week, and they take blind students from all over the country and even all over the world uh, to NASA Space Camp uh, in Alabama, and they get to there's different levels. So I did the elementary school level and the middle school, and you get to build rockets and get to launch them and learn about what it's like to be an astronaut. You get to do a couple of missions, like mock missions, and it's just a really cool, really neat experience. Uh, and yeah, it was quite a long time ago, so I'm trying to remember everything that we did.
Yeah,
But they
I'm trying
pack
to
a lot
remember.
into a
And
whole
I'm
week.
trying, indeed, and I'm trying to remember it too. Looking back on it now that so so I'm 28 years old. I think you're 3 years younger than me, right?
I'm 23, so I'm
Whoa.
5 years younger.
Okay, so you're significantly younger than me. I didn't realize the gap was 5 years. I thought it was a 3 year gap. Okay, you're 23 and I'm 28. Okay, so yeah, so the gap it's not obviously no big deal, but that's actually quite significant. Um, I remember certain things. I remember going several times, and I remember going through the different like levels, as you said, the different levels of camp. I don't remember going as an elementary schooler, though. I only remember that the idea came to me. Um, and how did I get interested in doing it in the first place? Well, listeners, I don't know. I suppose when I was 12. I probably had more of an interest in being an astronaut. Of course, I would be happy to be an astronaut today, although I'm never going to get that chance in my life. That's okay, but I would gladly go up. But what about you, Jason? Do you want to be an astronaut?
Um, I think I might have thought about it at the time. Of course, I mean, it requires, of course, back then I didn't really know what all it would require, you know. It requires basically a science degree almost, I think, these days. Um, and if not, if you don't have a science degree, you probably need a boatload of money, I would think. Maybe someday
Maybe.
it'll come to reality. I mean, you never know.
Yeah, that's the scary thing. We never know what will become reality because we have a hard enough time telling what's real right now, what's real today.
Yeah.
God only knows. Um, I mean, earlier today. I was watching an interesting show on Netflix about the universe and about what will eventually happen, you know, to our sun. And of course, our sun is a star, so eventually that sun will eventually fizzle out. They think, but they aren't really sure. So I hope that I hope that when that happens, I hope that humans are somewhere else in the universe, living on other planets. But I recall a very entertaining thing happened, and this brings up a really interesting philosophical question. I remember that when NASA landed their probe on Mars, um, relatively recently, maybe a year ago, and they were talking about it a lot, and they were showing pictures of it a lot. I remember that I told my parents, "Oh, this is so fantastic! I'm so proud of NASA for getting onto Mars." And they said, especially my mother, she said, "Oh, wow, I think this is such a waste of money. With $6 billion, we could solve a lot of problems on our planet rather than going to other planets to take pictures." So I think it's an interesting philosophical question. Why are we not able to solve the problems on our own planet, but we're so willing and so motivated to go to other planets? I don't know. Do you have an opinion about that?
Yeah, I don't know. It's fascinating. From a financial and economic standpoint, it definitely brings up a lot of, a lot of controversy, I guess you could
So
say, a
why do
lot of
you
different
think? I
opinions.
mean, if you were to give out your opinion, why do you think our government spends 6 billion on? I'm just throwing that number out there. X billion on space travel, but we don't really invest billions in solving the problems of our own planet. Why do you think that's the case?
I don't know. I think space travel, I mean, we always want to have the best scientific discoveries, so and I think just the unknown, all the the things, information uh to discover. It's
Right.
probably the big thing.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So, then talk about some other. Do you remember meeting anyone at Space Camp who was, you know, particularly interesting? Do you remember meeting any of the international students?
A little bit, yeah. I'm trying to remember. I remember there were some from Ireland. There were a lot
Yeah,
from
there were
Canada, I remember.
a lot from Canada. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess one thing that I learned at Space Camp was that, so I grew up in kind of, ever since a little kid, I've been involved in the National Federation of the Blind, and I was, always used, uh, kind of transitioning into blindness. I've always, used an NFB cane. I always kind of had the philosophy of like being independent and only going, like, not going sighted guide extremely often per se. I mean, not saying that I never would, but I went to NFB summer camps and what have you. And I remember when I went to space camp when I was 12, I met, I remember there were like all these blind kids from my state. Um, and I didn't know them through my state's NFB. chapter, and I remember thinking, okay, why is this? You know, uh, I don't know. It was, and I realized that there's a lot of different kind of philosophies out there as far as, cane travel and, independence and what have you. Some people have had different levels of opportunities. And
Yeah.
uh, I think when I was 12, I was a little bit, I was, I kind of had a tendency, like most 12-year-olds, like, I thought I knew everything, uh, kind of like, kind of like got ahead of myself sometimes. So like, I was like, why are these people not in the NFB? Like, I was completely blown away, if you will, by the fact that these kids were like from my home state and they were blind or at least legally blind, and they weren't part of the NFB. Like, I was completely blown away by that because I guess back then I kind of thought that all blind people were in the NFB. Uh, yeah, that was one thing that I remember, and I also remember going a lot of times. Uh, this isn't really something that I'm a big fan of, but a lot of times people who had lower amounts of vision, like I personally, I don't have any vision at all, uh, would walk side guide with people who were still blind in the grand scheme of things, but maybe had a little bit of vision. And I don't think that's I don't think that's all that great personally. It's somebody who, even though they may have a lot of vision, if they're legally, even though they may have some vision, if they're blind, I mean, I think that I would encourage them to use a cane,
Mm-hmm.
and to learn alternative techniques. And a lot of them, like some of them didn't even use canes. And they, some of the counselors with the space camp and the teachers from like the school for the blind, kind of they were completely okay with students who were still legally blind, still had less than 10% of vision, you know, giving sighted guide to me and to other students who uh, were completely blind, or maybe just who didn't have any vision, who had light perception. And I just think that there should have I don't think that there is enough of a focus on independence. And I
Mm-hmm.
mean,
Mm-hmm.
honestly,
Good.
if
Good.
you
You're digging. You're moving in the right direction. This is what I wanted to talk about. So yeah, tell them exactly. Yes. Good.
you want me to keep going?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there just wasn't as much of a focus on independence as I think that there could have been.
Right.
And I think when a bunch of blind people travel together, we really don't need to be holding on to each other necessarily. I mean, if it's a really crowded place, um, you know, then, like, for example, I went to I did an adult adjustment to blindness training program in Louisiana at the Louisiana Center for the Blind when I was 18. And there was one time when um, we'd kind of hold on to each other's shoulders to stay together when we went to Mardi Gras in New Orleans, because it's really crowded and you're on a street with a bunch of people, and you almost have to, it's hard to really hear each other sometimes, so you almost have to do that. But the big difference between that and sometimes what happened at space camp was at space camp, sometimes they would have, you would all hold on to each other, if you will, or a someone who has more vision would guide someone who has less vision. But that didn't happen like in Louisiana. It was just you're holding on to each other to stay together, and how much vision you have doesn't really matter at the end of the day. And and everybody's wearing sleep shades still, so everybody's at least during a lot of the time, everybody's wearing sleep shades, so everybody's learning how, regardless of how much vision they have, you're learning how to do it. um, you're learning how to use those alternative techniques that space camp you wouldn't really, those who had some vision wouldn't really be learning. And so, another thing that they like to do is they almost like to have what's called a hierarchy of sight. So basically, the person who has the most vision would be more toward the front of the line, and then they'd kind of go from front to back more or less in order of how much vision you had. So I would probably be at the very back in that kind of scenario, and that's not something that I'm a fan of.
Good. Really, really good points there. Yeah. Now that you're bringing up the sighted guide thing, I am remembering that. I don't remember quite what you mean about I don't specifically remember that whole hierarchy of vision, but you are probably right. You are right. I don't
It
specifically.
may not have happened at space camp, but it does happen in a lot of other contexts. I don't remember, but yeah,
Yeah, I
I
don't
think
know.
it is important to bring it up, though.
No, it's critical to bring it up, and I've noticed. Um, yeah, I don't know if that happened at space camp, but I've noticed that with a lot of organizations that with a lot of organizations that do work for blind people, there's a lot of talk about, well, how much can you see, and there's a lot of different categories and hierarchies. I've noticed this, and since since I tell people that I'm blind, even though that I can see, which to a blind, or our blind listeners will understand this, but since I tell everybody that I'm blind, I don't care. Yes, I agree with you, Jason. It's not appropriate, but I also don't care that there's all these other strange levels and hierarchies. Either you're blind or you're not. You know, I'm not sure why we need that type of thing. I'm not. I'm not really convinced upon the validity of that system. I don't know what its purpose is. Do you know what the purpose of that type of thing is?
Not particularly. I mean, different. I guess people with different amounts of vision might do some things differently. I mean, I think anybody who, honestly, I think the most successful blind people, even if they have a small amount of vision, they usually learn Braille. They usually use a cane. They usually use alternative techniques that, um, in their daily lives. And a lot of times I found that sometimes, you know, certain kind of low vision techniques like zoom text, and which is a screen magnification program, and using your vision might work uh, for some things, and it might work for a period of time. But a lot of different eye conditions, I'm not an expert on them per se, but they kind of gradually get worse over time. So using your vision might work, but then when you start losing it and keeps getting worse, it doesn't work. Or it might,
Indeed.
when it comes to reading, some people, they might be able to read print for maybe, if it's the only thing that's available to them, or they might be able to even read it well, but then at a certain point, if they say they have to read for something for a couple of hours, it's a college textbook or something for work. Eventually,
Right.
maybe after some people, maybe say after 20 minutes, might start straining their eyes. So that's not helpful. You don't want to be reading if your eyes are hurting. I mean, I don't have any of that experience personally, but this is just, what I've heard from people who have. And so, whereas if you learn Braille and you become really good at it, that's not an issue, you know.
Right. Definitely. Yeah, you're bringing up a lot of really good points. And what you said about the NFB thing is true. Um, and I noticed as a child going through space camp that the NFB, in my opinion, and at the time, the National Federation of the Blind did not support space camp for the reason, I think, that students are allowed to attend space camp without being independent, and that the space camp facilitates, uh, those types of things, the sighted guide, the not being independent, that type of thing. So I'm suspicious of that. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, I could definitely understand that. I mean, but at the same time, I think there was a lot of independence in other ways. You are kind of, uh, you're living in like the space habitat, and you're with other guys your age, and you don't necessarily have somebody supervising you all the time. In the like, say in the evening, for example,
Yeah,
you're using the public restroom on your own, and that kind of thing. I mean, they have always have people around, you know, chaperones and stuff, but you're kind of, in that sense. I mean, and some people who need more help with that, I think they can provide more assistance, and there wasn't independence as far as that in that regard, I think. But definitely when it comes to travel, and there really wasn't. When we were going from place to place, there really wasn't the independence that as much encouragement of it as I think there should have been. But then again, it only lasts for a week. So,
it's true
whereas
too.
a lot of the NFB programs, like the buddy programs for middle schoolers, they're like 3 or 4 weeks. The high school programs are usually 6 to 8 weeks, which so there's a lot more time to hone in on those kinds of things. Whereas a space camp, they can only have blind students there for a week out of a whole year. So how do you really, with all the space stuff, how do you really teach, if somebody needs instruction, how do you really make time for that with the busy schedule that you already have? So I could understand why, and with the vast number of students that they have, I could understand why it would be tough uh, to really implement those kinds of things. And then, say that somebody's being independent for a week, somebody's maybe they're traveling a little bit more on their own. They're still with people, but they're not going side to guide as much, and maybe they're carrying their own tray in the dining hall. I mean, those kinds of things I think you could definitely teach within a week. But then, because they would only happen for a week, when they get back home, how likely is it that they're going to continue those things? Because a week isn't really enough sometimes for those kinds of things to stick, especially if somebody's been doing it for you, for a long period of time for all your life.
Right, right. And I'm not saying that all of the blind people at Space Camp by any means were completely cared for their entire lives. I think actually the vast majority are the opposite. The vast majority are very, very, very high functioning, overly motivated, independent people to begin with. But
Right.
I think what it is that I think that since you are allowed to go to the camp without being independent, I think that sends the wrong message. But
The wrong
you,
message. Yeah.
I very well could. Now, I haven't, talked to these people in years.
Oh no, I haven't
Literally,
either.
um, see, when was the last year I went to it? I, I think I went. Yeah, I went one more time in high school. Which I was 15, 25. Literally 13 years have gone by since I have been down there. Wow, really? Yeah,
Wow.
sheesh. Yeah, 13 years ago is the last
For
time I
me, it
was
would have
down there.
been about. I was 12, so it would have been 11 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a
So I
long
don't
time. I
know what
mean,
it's like now.
I don't. It's probably very different now. I don't know. I mean, things are probably still the same, but I don't know. Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so basically, after space camp and after you went to high school, then why don't we move towards talking about your experience in university? Now, my experience in university was a bit of a mixed bag with a lot of things. There were some highs and definitely some lows. So what I want to know is tell the listeners, if you would like, about your experience with the whole university business, and start there.
Yeah. So I attended. So I'm not. Should I not say the name of the college that I attended? Uh, for location.
Yeah, yeah. You don't need to actually, it's up to you.
Okay. So I'll say it. I attended Messiah College. It's a small Christian school. It's founded by the Brethren in Christ uh, Church primarily in Pennsylvania. Has about 3,000 students, and I start my major. At first, like I came in as undecided, but I ended up going choosing marketing, which was falls under the business department, and so I obviously I had graduated from I had gone through the training center program before attending college, so I was really good with the travel stuff and living on my own, and pretty good with the computer. But what I came to find out was that there really aren't a lot of blind people out there who study what I studied, um,
Hmm.
and the business isn't really a common major right now for blind people, is what I have found. It
Really?
is becoming more and more, I think, but it seems like a lot of blind people, at least people who I knew, different students, seems like law is very popular in political science. Um, it also seems like education and those kinds of things are very popular, but business and economics doesn't seem like it's quite as it is. I think it is up and coming. Um, I know a couple other uh, students. I know one student who I think did like computer science and statistics and business. I know a couple others, but generally speaking, it's not a huge. Doesn't seem to be a huge discipline for uh, blind college students to get into. Uh, so I some of the challenges that I encountered was uh, figuring out, okay, how do I how does a blind person learn uh, take accounting, for example, or financial management? Because a lot of NFB has really good resources for math, and but there's science and engineering division, which includes math, and there's like a math mailing list. But that seems like it's more focused, generally speaking, on engineering type math, which I didn't really need to know. I mean, I took my first math class that I took was called Math 107. It was applied math for management, so it was a little bit like a pre-calc for business. So there was a little bit of calculus, a few derivatives, but uh, it was very different than say what an engineer would take. Uh, and so I was able to get that book in Braille through a Braille list. Um, but they only she brailled the parts that I needed. So we corresponded with the teacher, and so the teacher only used certain parts of it and certain problems. So instead of brailing the whole book, they would just braille what I needed, which saved a lot of paper. Um,
By the way, um, in general, would you like to say anything in regards to talk about some of the professors at this school,
Yeah.
were they,
Yeah,
because
definitely.
because a lot of blind people lately, myself included, but I've been on a lot of these groups, on Facebook and now WhatsApp and various, social media platforms. And there's been a lot of complaints about professors, and they're oftentimes, at best, incredibly poor social skills, and at worst, their unwillingness to accommodate blind students. In my opinion, I think that's a very serious problem and a big, big problem. But tell us, if you would like, about your experience at Messiah College
Yeah.
in dealing with the professors.
Yeah, definitely. Honestly, I had pretty good experiences. So I took economics, and one of my favorite professors that I had was for macroeconomics. He was really good with. We used a lot of wiki sticks, to demonstrate, your
Mm-hmm.
supply curves and demand curves and elasticity and all those concepts. Rather low tech, but it worked well. Um, I've and he was great, and he was a hard professor too. And I did. I think I finished with an A. I've also, as far as my faculty advisor, was I'm also my marketing professor. He was really great. I actually, during my senior year, so actually I just recently graduated from college in May. So he and I actually wrote an article about marketing to blind consumers, and
Hmm.
yeah, so that was kind of like my final project for my marketing management and strategy class. A lot of the other students ever had to create a website, which is a little bit harder just in general and more visual. So he and I uh, co-authored this article together, and it got published in Compro Bees, which isn't a major. It's not an extremely major publication, but it's read by a lot of public relations professionals and what have you. Uh, so that was really good. I also took a digital marketing class where we all had to write a blog, and my professor was really good about working with me with that. It was
Hmm.
through WordPress. I need to
Mm-hmm.
update it, but WordPress is overall pretty accessible, and a blog, it's mostly text. Some people do put pictures and images on it, but you don't have to in order for it to do well. And I got quite a lot of people reading my entries, uh, so that was a good experience. I think, honestly, uh, my marketing classes were pretty not extremely visual. They involved, there was a lot
Mm-hmm.
of class discussion, a lot of reading. I took consumer behavior and
Mm-hmm.
market research and a lot of really interesting stuff. I think the hardest classes were, economics, accounting, financial management. So for those classes, my professors, they were really good. Honestly, they worked with me. I used the disability services office. They would allow me to. They would hire readers,
Mm-hmm.
who were. It was usually a student who had taken the class before, and so they would oftentimes they would explain things that I didn't quite understand in class, and when I would take tests, for example, financial management. An example I'll say was creating a statement of cash flows. You can do it in Excel, but there's kind of a lot of numbers that have to go in different places. And if I were doing it every day, I would probably have taken the time to learn to do it on my own. Um, but basically, how we did it was I had all the information, uh, and he would read me the statement, the balance sheet, you know, what was being, the assets and the liabilities, and basically in the statement of cash flows, for those who don't know, there's kind of has three different sections: operating, investing, and financing. So I would basically just tell the reader which things went into operating, which things went into investing, which which transactions, if you will, and which went into financing, and whether or not to add or subtract, because that's basically what you need to know. And there's, without getting too technical, there's different rules for how that works. So that's kind of how we worked around that. So there were some things that I did, completely independently, and then, for like, I'm not going to be an accountant per se. I needed to take accounting to graduate and to have a basic knowledge of accounting as a business person. It's important to know the terminology, but it's not something that I was going to be doing on a daily basis. So I didn't really take the time to learn QuickBooks or anything like that. Not saying that I couldn't have, but I found that with college, sometimes you kind of have to figure out what's important, how you're going to get the most out of it, and what's worth spending your time on, and what isn't per se.
Precisely. It's a really outstanding response. Really, really well done for you. And I'm really glad that it sounds like you really had an overall good experience there.
I did,
Um,
yes. I got involved in a lot of extracurricular activities. One thing that I did was it's called the collaboratory, and it's a lot of engineering majors do it. Well, they have to do it, and they do anything from building bridges in Panama to the project that I was on was 3D mapping of campus, not only for disability and accessibility purposes, but also just, it's cool to have a 3D map. And so I
yeah.
work with engineers uh, and kind of eventually it's probably going to have quite a few copies of it, and it'll be used by admissions so that, when
Hmm.
people visit the campus for the first time, they can see a product of what students have been doing. So that was something that I worked on, and I was on the decision making board, the student decision making board of that organization. And so it's basically different projects. All the engineers have to do it in order to graduate, but then other majors get involved with it too. So that's kind of why it's called the collaboratory, because people bring their expertise together to collaborate. Um, so they even have a business and economic development team, and so they work anything from you know going to other nations and doing different projects to locally on campus to there's a they did a also did some science camps for elementary school students. That was one of the projects in the area, and that had a lot of education majors in it. So that was really cool to be involved in.
Hmm.
I also was in the public relations and marketing clubs. I was a student ambassador, so I gave campus tours to prospective students with the admissions department.
That's really fascinating. Did you ever, in your tour groups, did you ever have anyone with a disability?
Uh, I do not believe that I did.
Because that would have been a really interesting tour and a really rewarding tour for someone who's blind or deaf or any disability, really, to see that there's already a successful person at the university who's blind. That would have
Right,
been really
definitely.
cool. Yeah.
And I also did an off-campus study in
Hmm.
Nashville for a whole semester. I did that fall of my
Yeah,
senior year.
I noticed that. I noticed that. So that sounded like a lot of fun. I saw that on Facebook. It looked really interesting. So what
Yeah, it
can you
really
tell us about
was.
Nashville?
It was called the Contemporary Music Center, and it was basically anyone who uh, was interested in the music industry could do it. So there's kind of three different tracks. So it was about 30 college students from different Christian colleges from across the country. So there were, in my semester, there were three others from Messiah, and there were some from Florida, there were some from Minnesota, uh, one from the King's College in New York City, so all over. And you spend it's a whole semester in Nashville, and um, some people are artists, so they write their own songs, and then there's and perform focus on writing and performing their own songs. Then there's the tech crew, which does all the recording, the mixing. Every week we would have a show. So setting up the sound and the lighting, the audio visual, the all that stuff. The monitors. Basically, how to they what they focused on was conducting a show. Setting it up, all the technology, cabling, everything, and then I was on the business side, so I was focused on the business side of the show, so the public relations and the budgeting and that kind of thing, and the email blast, the press release, and at the end of the program, our final exam, if you will, was planning a tour. So it was like 3 days, or no, 4 days actually, and two different colleges where we would, it was full on, almost as close to a real concert tour as possible. The tour bus, trucks full of equipment, and going, being on the road, going to different colleges and setting up stage and performing for like basically 4 days in a row. So I was on the business side of all the budgeting, and I was one of the people basically running the budget for the tour, um, and
Amazing.
the logistics. The working with the travel agent to book the hotel and all that kind of stuff. That was mainly what I did,
Great.
and I
Great.
found that when you're doing something of that nature, um, I had to learn to be very amicable and be able to get along in a lot of different environments, because you go into these schools, colleges that you're completely unfamiliar with. Granted, I wasn't, uh, you know, on stage uh, per se, but I was. You have a lot of equipment moving around. You got drums and monitors and computers and soundboards and all those things, a lot of equipment moving around. So um, just being in that environment with it's it's kind of like organized chaos, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of
uh,
course. Makes sense. It's
yeah
organized and
so
it's chaos.
yeah so it was a little bit uh, tough for me to do a lot. I mean, it all had to be done very quickly was the thing. So kind of how they included me in that was, oftentimes I would operate the ladder, like operate the lift on the trucks. So they would, come by with the trust, or the equipment, and I would, basically communicate with them, and as to, when to move the ramp up, when to move it down, etc. Because couldn't necessarily. It was a little tough for me to be involved in directly, uh, you know, packing things up and unpacking them because, it all kind of had to. For one thing, you're in an unfamiliar environment. You got to pack and unpack extremely quickly, and uh, you don't always know uh, where everything's supposed to go, and it could always change. So that's so, but I learned how to just like understand what was going on, and I learned a lot just from working with the people who I was working with, and from that whole experience of the tour and of you know doing a whole semester in Nashville. You know, the first day you're moving into an apartment with three guys who you don't really know. Well, I knew one of them, but I didn't. He was from Messiah, but the other two were from Florida, and had some were from slightly different backgrounds than I was. So you're learning to you're being independent. It's almost like I almost personally think that people in college should spend a semester off campus or live in an apartment for a semester if they can, so that when they're out of college they have those independent skills. Not just blind people in college, but just
No,
uh,
you're very right.
anybody in college. I think it's just good to have that experience, because when you're on campus, you don't oftentimes have to worry about cooking your own food, and that kind of thing, and budgeting, and all that. But when you're living in that type of environment, you have a little bit more responsibility per se, and you have to live with people who you don't know, and learn to get along with each other for the semester, and
Yeah, cool.
somewhat close quarters, and that's
Somewhat.
just a good experience
An
in
apartment,
general.
an apartment's pretty close. It can't be too much further than close quarters, or else you'd be in two different apartments. It has to be close quarters, yeah, or else it wouldn't be an apartment. Yeah. Well, did you have any? Did anybody throughout this whole semester? I'm sure at one point something happened. Did anybody, you know, have a meltdown? Throw a chair out the window. Spill something all over the floor, and then someone else slipped in it, or was there any big? Was there any big, like, I'm sure there was at least one big meltdown, like just one time the whole time you were down there.
Oh yeah, I mean there are all kinds of instances, but you learn how to deal with it, and and move on from it.
Like what? I mean, can you give our listeners maybe a
Trying to
funny
think.
one or something kind of silly that happened? Or
Um, yeah, I mean we had one or two students who they had a knack for showing up late. Uh, and in the music industry, that's pretty bad.
yeah, in my
Basically, kind of the
industry,
motto is on time is late, early is
yeah,
on time, and on time is late, and late is fired. Uh,
yeah, that's my attitude towards that too, and I'm overly sensitive about that myself. So, but some people just don't get that. So what
yeah,
happened?
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And one time on the tour, uh, one of the guys forgot his bass from the his hotel room, so we were about to leave, and he had to like run in and get it, and people were kind of, we were kind of perturbed,
I see. I see. Yeah, yeah. That's frustrating when people can be forgetful like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. Mm. What was the funniest thing that happened when you were living in Nashville, working on this program?
The funniest. I'm trying to. Um. I don't know. I mean, you got. We all became pretty close with each other because we were working with each other every day, essentially. Um. Our professors, with the program, kind of had, funny ways of uh, saying things sometimes. Um, the tech professor, his main phrase was killer, like when it was really good, when something was done well.
Yeah, yeah. That's
They,
normal. A lot of
the
people, I
music
noticed that.
industry kind of has its own sort of language.
Yeah,
We would watch movies on Sunday nights that were usually related to the music industry or related to what we were doing, and like one of them we watched Spinal Tap, which is the music industry is kind of based on Spinal Tap. A lot like turn it up to 11 is a common phrase that you hear. Like that's where that comes from, and
yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm. So,
and
and I've
sometimes
never.
you
Oh,
would
you
hear
says go.
things like okay, can we get some love out of this board, like out of the soundboard, like you know when we wanted it to do what we needed it to do, you know that's kind of thing. And there's a lot of fine tuning that happens because every singer sounds different. Every song kind of has you know different technical settings that are best for it. So just like learning about all that process was, I never knew that there was so much involved until
Until you
I
did it.
did the program. It was just
Cool,
really
cool.
cool to
So
experience all that.
that sounded really interesting. It sounded really, really good. Sounds really good for anyone, blind or not. Sounds like a lot of only if you're fascinated by the music industry and you really want to work in that field. Or else, actually, if you don't want to work in the music field and you do that program, that sounds like a punishment. That sounds horrible. If you don't want to work in, that sounds like a god awful thing. If you don't want to work in that field, but if you want to work there, that sounds like heaven. That sounds like a lot of fun. Yeah. So with those singers that you were working with who were performing basically obviously to get recognition and get onto a label, so which one of those singers did get, so did any of them land a major record deal?
Yeah, well, the goal wasn't really for them to get a label. Like they were all college students. Um, Although one of them actually did release a record, an EP. So like a 5 song record. And you know, there's they make oftentimes they'll come back to Nashville after graduating from college and make more connections and continue making music. Some don't always. It just depends. A lot of the tech people, uh, some of the tech people moved back down to Nashville and got jobs down there in the tech side of the industry. So yeah, it's I mean, a lot of them, the artists, everybody's kind of at different levels, right? So yeah, but yeah, so one of them did end up releasing an EP, and so it was pretty cool to see that form and to I some of the recording of it and the seeing the techs operate all the equipment and do and setting up the tracks and seeing all that come together was really neat.
Cool, cool, interesting. Yeah. um So, so what is I mean, did they, I mean, I suppose with what your side of it, they didn't talk directly to you about it a whole lot, but obviously you overheard conversations throughout the time you were there. I mean, really, some of our listeners might want to know, I don't know, what is the music industry or the music world really looking for today when they actually consider talent? Basically, what constitutes as good to today? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of different things. So a lot of times, what they talked about a lot was music programs that colleges have are very much focused on more the traditional and the classical side of things, whereas Nashville, it's all either going focused on getting the music uh, you know out on Spotify or to the radio. So it's a very different kind of vibe. Uh, people who study music in college, which a lot of the people in the program were music majors in college, but then they send them to this program so that they learn more about the contemporary uh, field, because when you study music in college, it's very much focused on practice, and um, you know you have to get every note exactly right, more per se, and it's playing classical pieces and singing songs in other languages, singing stuff from the Renaissance period, whereas Nashville, it's writing song. You write a song. Basically, the students who were artists, basically had a week to. They had basically a couple of days to. Well, within the time of a week, they had to have a song written, the lyrics, the melody, everything. They had to have a demo recorded, sometimes a couple of demos recorded, and then have it practiced so that it could be performed on Thursday night. So they basically had from Saturday to Wednesday night. Wednesday afternoon was hammer time. So basically, it was getting it, practicing it for the show, essentially. So basically, they had only within the course of Friday was game tape. So they would talk about the show and what went well, what didn't go well, and focus on things to improve on for the next show. And so, they didn't really have. You don't really have. That's not really a lot of time if you think about it, to have a song written, have it recorded, and then or at least have a demo recorded, and then have your tracks ready. There's a lot that happens within that week, or 5 or 6 days, more or less, in practicality. Yeah. So actually, probably more like 4 days. Friday's game tape. So most of them probably started writing their song say Saturday. Then come Wednesday, you gotta have you gotta be almost ready to perform it. Or so it's a lot different, because then say studying music in college, you have your pieces that you have to learn for the semester, and you're getting ready for the one final recital. Whereas Nashville and the contemporary world, you're playing multiple shows. You're going on tour, you're playing shows every day. So if you sometimes you kind of have to think on your feet a lot more. Like if you're a musician, and you got to be able to oftentimes you got to be able to just kind of play a song right off the bat, even if you don't necessarily know it in full. Because that's just kind of the reality of it. And sometimes if you don't know, you got to be able to kind of make up things as you go, at least enough to impress the audience, right? And you're trying to impress an audience who is paying money to attend the show. There's the money factor as well. And there's, even we learned about in the business track, if you're really, we didn't deal with this a lot, but there's all kinds of legal stuff that's involved with
tons of it.
Oh yeah, there's
tons
with
tons of it, and
money and where it goes, and how it how the managers are paid, and
right,
setting up the concert, how that's
Jason,
different ways, booking agents, and yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so really, really good, really good. I just wanted you to get to the end of that thought. I do need to wrap this up. Let me, um, just give me just literally 1 second. Let me turn off this timer, this alarm. Hold on. Um, you are so right. Let me ask you this: I do need to get going, and we do need to stop here. I have some things to do. Um, Let me ask you. So, do you want to come on my show again? And what did you think of this show?
Yeah, I would. Thought it
Oh,
was
good.
great.
Great. Well, I think you did a really good job, and I'm suspicious that our listeners are going to have a lot more questions about your experience in Nashville because that's a really it's a really valuable life experience from the music, the art, the tech, the legal, all the laws, all the business, all of that put together to make a show work.
Yeah.
So, let me just do this. So don't move. Let me just kind of say thank you, and I need you to stay on so that I can do my outro, and we will be in touch privately. I can message you some other times where you could, where we could do a part two. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that got really interesting. You've been listening to Aaron's Show, the podcast for blind people, where we certainly talk about issues in the blindness community. And that, by the way, just for some station identification, with Jason Polanski. I've never had him on before, but I'm really glad he was here. He talked a lot about the music industry today. By the way, you did mention Spotify, and I'm so glad. And speaking of it, thank you, because you should have reminded our listeners, Jason, that Aaron's Show is proudly broadcasting on Spotify, along with Anchor, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Radio Public, and Breaker. Those are all the platforms. And as I say on my show, before I say it, I'm going to just turn off the recording after I say this final thing. Jason, I'll be in touch with you. I do have to be going. Have a very good evening to you and to our listeners from around the world. Have a good day today and a great day tomorrow.
Good evening and have a great day, everyone.
Okay, good job. Bye.
Bye.